Republican Party, United States. The Republican Party, also referred to as the GOP Grand Old Party, is one of the two major contemporary political parties in the United States, along with its main historical rival, the Democratic Party. The GOP was founded in 1854 by opponents of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which allowed for the potential expansion of chattel slavery into the Western territories. It was simultaneously strengthened by the collapse of the Whig Party, which had previously been one of the two major parties in the country. Upon founding, the Republican Party supported economic reform and classical liberalism while opposing the expansion of slavery. Abraham Lincoln was the first Republican president. Under the leadership of Lincoln and the Republican Congress, slavery was banned in the United States in 1865. The GOP was generally dominant during the third and the fourth party system periods. It was strongly committed to protectionism and tariffs at its founding, but grew more supportive of free trade in the 20th century. After 1912, the Republican Party began to undergo an ideological shift to the right. Following the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the party's core base shifted, with southern states becoming more reliably Republican in presidential politics. After the Supreme Court's 1973 decision in Roe v. Wade, the Republican Party opposed abortion in its party platform and grew its support among evangelicals. Its 21st century ideology is American conservatism, which incorporates both social conservatism and fiscal conservatism. The GOP supports lower taxes, free market capitalism, restrictions on immigration, increased military spending, gun rights, restrictions on abortion, deregulation, and restrictions on labor unions. In the 21st century, the demographic base skews toward men, people living in rural areas, people living in the American South, and white Americans, particularly white evangelical Christians. Its most recent presidential nominee was Donald Trump, who served as the 45th President of the United States from 2017 to 2021. There have been 19 Republican presidents, the most from any one political party. As of early 2022, the GOP controls 28 state governorships, 30 state legislatures, and 23 state government trifectas. Governorship and both legislative chambers, 6 of the 9 sitting U.S. Supreme Court justices were nominated by Republican presidents. History: 19th century. The Republican Party was founded in the northern states in 1854 by forces opposed to the expansion of slavery, ex-Whigs and ex-Free Soilers. The Republican Party quickly became the principal opposition to the dominant Democratic Party and the briefly popular Know Nothing Party. The party grew out of opposition to the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which repealed the Missouri Compromise and opened Kansas Territory and Nebraska Territory to chattel slavery and future admission as slave states. The Republicans called for economic and social modernization. They denounced the expansion of chattel slavery as a great evil, but did not call for ending it in the southern states. The first public meeting of the general anti-Nebraska movement, and to which the name Republican was proposed, was held on March 20th, 1854, at the Little White Schoolhouse in Ripon, Wisconsin. The name was partly chosen to pay homage to Thomas Jefferson's Democratic Republican Party. The first official party convention was held on July 6, 1854, in Jackson, Michigan. The party emerged from the great political realignment of the mid-1850s. Historian William Ginnap argues that the great realignment of the 1850s began before the Whigs' collapse and was caused not by politicians but by voters at the local level. The central forces were ethnocultural, involving tensions between pietistic Protestants versus liturgical Catholics, Lutherans, and Episcopalians regarding Catholicism, Prohibition, and Nativism. Abolition did play a role, but it was less important at first. The Know Nothing Party embodied the social forces at work, but its weak leadership was unable to solidify its organization, and the Republicans picked it apart. Nativism was so powerful that the Republicans could not avoid it, but they did minimize it and turn voter wrath against the threat that slave owners would buy up the good farmlands wherever chattel slavery was allowed. The realignment was powerful because it forced voters to switch parties, as typified by the rise and fall of the Know Nothings, the rise of the Republican Party, and the splits in the Democratic Party. At the 1856 Republican National Convention, the party adopted a national platform emphasizing opposition to the expansion of chattel slavery into U.S. territories. While Republican nominee John C. Fremont lost the 1856 United States presidential election to Democrat doughface James Buchanan, Buchanan only managed to win 4 of the 14 northern states, winning his home state of Pennsylvania narrowly. Republicans fared better in congressional and local elections, but Know Nothing candidates took a significant number of seats, creating an awkward three-party arrangement. Despite the loss of the presidency and the lack of a majority in Congress, Republicans were able to orchestrate the Republican Speaker of the House, which went to Nathaniel P. Banks. Historian James M. McPherson writes regarding Banks' speakership that if any one moment marked the birth of the Republican Party, this was it. The Republicans were eager for the elections of 1860. Former Illinois Representative Abraham Lincoln spent several years building support within the party, campaigning heavily for Fremont in 1856 and making a bid for the Senate in 1858, losing to Democrat Stephen A. Douglas, but gaining national attention for the Lincoln-Douglas debates it produced. At the 1860 Republican National Convention, Lincoln consolidated support among opponents of New York Senator William H. Seward, a fierce abolitionist who some Republicans feared would be too radical for crucial states such as Pennsylvania and Indiana, as well as those who disapproved of his support for Irish immigrants. Lincoln won on the third ballot and was ultimately elected president in the general election in a rematch against Douglas. Lincoln had not been on the ballot in a single southern state, and even if the vote for Democrats had not been split between Douglas, John C. Breckinridge, and John Bell, the Republicans would have still won but without the popular vote. This election result helps kickstart the American Civil War, which lasted from 1861 until 1865. The election of 1864 united war Democrats with the GOP and saw Lincoln and Tennessee Democratic Senator Andrew Johnson get nominated on the National Union Party ticket. Lincoln was reelected under Republican congressional leadership. The 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution, which banned chattel slavery in the United States, passed in the Senate in 1864 and the House in 1865. It was ratified in December 1865. Reconstruction, the gold standard, and the Gilded Age. Radical Republicans during Lincoln's presidency felt he wasn't going far enough in his eradication of slavery and opposed his 10% plan. Radical Republicans passed the Wade-Davis Bill in 1864, which sought to enforce the taking of the ironclad oath for all former Confederates. Lincoln vetoed the bill, believing it would jeopardize the peaceful reintegration of the Confederate States into the United States. Following the assassination of Lincoln, Johnson ascended to the presidency and was deplored by radical Republicans. Johnson was vitriolic in his criticisms of the Radical Republicans during a national tour ahead of the 1866 midterm elections. In his view, Johnson saw radical republicanism as the same as a secessionism, both being two extremist sides of the political spectrum. Anti-Johnson Republicans won a two-thirds majority in both chambers of Congress following the elections, which helped lead the way toward his impeachment and near ouster from office in 1868. That same year, former Union Army General Ulysses S. Grant was elected as the next Republican president. Grant was a radical Republican, which created some division within the party. Some, such as Massachusetts Senator Charles Sumner and Illinois Senator Lyman Trumbull, opposed most of his Reconstructionist policies. Others found contempt with the large-scale corruption present in the Grant administration, with the emerging stalwart faction defending Grant and the spoils system, whereas the half-breeds pushed for reform of the civil service. Republicans who opposed Grant branched off to form the Liberal Republican Party, nominating Horace Greeley in 1872. The Democratic Party attempted to capitalize on this divide in the GOP by co-nominating Greeley under their party banner. Greeley's positions proved inconsistent with the liberal Republican Party that nominated him, with Greeley supporting high tariffs despite the party's opposition. Grant was easily re-elected. The 1876 general election saw a contentious conclusion as both parties claimed victory, despite three southern states still not officially declaring a winner at the end of Election Day. Voter suppression had occurred in the South to depress the black and white Republican vote, which gave Republican controlled returning officers enough of a reason to declare fraud. Intimidation and violence soiled the state's results. They proceeded to throw out enough Democratic votes for Republican Rutherford B. Hayes to be declared the winner. Still, Democrats refused to accept the results, and an electoral commission made up of members of Congress was established to decide who would be awarded the state's electors. After the commission voted along party lines in Hayes' favor, Democrats threatened to delay the counting of electoral votes indefinitely so no president would be inaugurated on March 4th. This resulted in the Compromise of 1877, and Hayes finally became president. Hayes doubled down on the gold standard, which had been signed into law by Grant with the Coinage Act of 1873 as a solution to the depressed American economy in the aftermath of the Panic of 1873. He also believed greenbacks posed a threat, greenbacks being money printed during the Civil War that was not backed by specie, which Hayes objected to as a proponent of hard money. Hayes sought to restock the country's gold supply, which by January 1879 succeeded as gold was more frequently exchanged for greenbacks compared to greenbacks being exchanged for gold. Ahead of the 1880 general election, Republican James G. Blaine ran for the party nomination, supporting Hayes' gold standard push and supporting his civil reforms, both falling short for the nomination. Blaine and opponent John Sherman backed Republican James A. Garfield, who agreed with Hayes' move in favor of the gold standard, but opposed his civil reform efforts. Garfield was elected but assassinated early into his term. However, his death helped create support for the Pendleton Civil Service Reform Act, which was passed in 1883. The bill was signed into law by Republican President Chester A. Arthur, who succeeded Garfield. Blaine once again ran for the presidency, winning the nomination but losing to Democrat Grover Cleveland in 1884, the first Democrat to be elected president since Buchanan. Dissident Republicans known as mugwumps, had defected Blaine due to corruption which had plagued his political career. Cleveland stuck to the gold standard policy, which eased most Republicans, but he came into conflict with the party regarding budding American imperialism. Republican Benjamin Harrison was able to reclaim the presidency from Cleveland in 1888. During his presidency, Harrison signed the Dependent and Disability Pension Act, which established pensions for all veterans of the Union who had served for more than 90 days and were unable to perform manual labor. A majority of Republicans supported the annexation of Hawaii. Under the new governance of Republicans Sanford B. Doe and Harrison, following his loss in 1892 to Cleveland, attempted to pass a treaty annexing Hawaii before Cleveland was to be inaugurated again. Cleveland opposed annexation, though Democrats were split geographically on the issue, with most northeastern Democrats proving to be the strongest voices of opposition. In 1896, Republican William McKinley's platform supported the gold standard and high tariffs, having been the creator and namesake for the McKinley Tariff for 1890, though having been divided on the issue prior to the 1896 Republican National Convention. McKinley decided to heavily favor the gold standard over free silver in his campaign messaging, but promised to continue bimetallism to ward off continued skepticism over the gold standard, which had lingered since the Panic of 1893. Democrat William Jennings Bryan proved to be a devoted adherent to the free silver movement, which cost Bryan the support of Democrat institutions such as Tammany Hall, the New York World, and a large majority of the Democratic Party's upper and middle class support. McKinley's defeated Bryan and returned the White House to Republican control until 1912. 20th century, the 1896 realignment cemented the Republicans as the party of big businesses, while Theodore Roosevelt added more small business support by his embrace of trust busting. He handpicked his successor, William Howard Taft, in 1988, but they became enemies as the party split down the middle. Taft defeated Roosevelt for the 1912 nomination, and Roosevelt ran on the ticket of his new Progressive Bull Moose Party. He called for social reforms, many of which were later championed by New Deal Democrats in the 1930s. He lost, and when most of his supporters returned to the GOP, they found they did not agree with the new conservative economic thinking, leading to an ideological shift to the right in the Republican Party. The Republicans returned to the White House throughout the 1920s, running on platforms of normalcy, business oriented efficiency, and high tariffs. The National Party platform avoided mention of prohibition, instead issuing a vague commitment to law and order. Warren G. Harding, Calvin Coolidge, and Herbert Hoover were resoundingly elected in 1920, 1924, and 1928, respectively. The Teapot Dome scandal threatened to hurt the party, but Harding died and the opposition splintered in 1924. The pro-business policies of the decade seemed to produce an unprecedented prosperity until the Wall Street crash of 1928 heralded the Great Depression. The New Deal coalition of Democrat Franklin D. Roosevelt controlled American politics for most of the next 3 decades, excluding the two-term presidency of Republican Dwight D. Eisenhower. After Roosevelt took office in 1933, New Deal legislation sailed through Congress and the economy moved sharply upward from its nadir in early 1933. However, long-term unemployment remained a drag until 1940. In the 1934 midterm elections, 10 Republican senators went down to defeat, leaving the GOP with only 25 senators against 71 Democrats. The House of Representatives likewise had overwhelming Democratic majorities. The Republican Party factionalized into a majority old right based in the Midwest, and the liberal wing based in the Northeast that supported much of the New Deal. The old right sharply attacked the Second New Deal and said it represented a class warfare and socialism. Roosevelt was re-elected in a landslide in 1936. However, as his second term began, the economy declined, strikes soared, and he failed to take control of the Supreme Court and purge the Southern conservatives from the Democratic Party. Republicans made a major comeback in the 1938 elections and had new rising stars such as Robert A. Taft of Ohio on the right and Thomas E. Dewey of New York on the left. Southern conservatives joined with most Republicans to form the Conservative Coalition, which dominated domestic issues in Congress until 1964. Both parties split on foreign policy issues, with the anti-war isolationists dominant in the Republican Party and the interventionists who wanted to stop Adolf Hitler dominant in the Democratic Party. Roosevelt won a third and a fourth term in 1940 and 1944, respectively. Conservatives abolished most of the New Deal during the war, but they did not attempt to do away with the Social Security or the agencies that regulated business. Unlike the moderate internationalist, largely Eastern Bloc of Republicans who accepted or at least acquired a quest in some of the Roosevelt Revolution and the essential premises of President Harry S. Truman's foreign policy, the Republican right at heart was counter-revolutionary, anti-collectivist, anti-communist, anti-New Deal, passionately committed to limited government, free market economics, and congressional as opposed to executive prerogatives. The GOP conservatives were obliged from the start to wage a constant two-front war against liberal Democrats from without and Me Too Republicans from within. After 1945, the internationalist wing of the GOP cooperated with Truman's Cold War foreign policy, funded the Marshall Plan, and supported NATO despite the continued isolationism of the old right. The second half of the 20th century saw the election or succession of Republican presidents Dwight D. Eisenhower, Richard Nixon, Gerald Ford, Ronald Reagan, and George H. W. Bush. Eisenhower had defeated conservative leader Senator Robert A. Taft for the 1952 nomination, but conservatives dominated the domestic policies of the Eisenhower administration. Voters liked Eisenhower much more than they liked the GOP, and he proved unable to shift the party to a more moderate position. Since 1976, liberalism has virtually faded out of the Republican Party, apart from a few northeastern holdouts. Historians battle in the liberal New York governor Nelson Rockefeller and his eponymous Rockefeller Republican faction for the party presidential nomination. With Goldwater poised to win, Rockefeller urged to mobilize his liberal faction relented. You're looking at it, buddy. I'm all that's left. Though Goldwater lost in a landslide, Reagan would make himself known as a prominent supporter of his throughout the campaign, delivering the time for choosing speech for him. He'd go on to become governor of California 2 years later, and in 1980 win the presidency. The presidency of Reagan, lasting from 1981 to 1989, constituted what is known as the Reagan Revolution. It was seen as a fundamental shift from the stagflation of the 1970s preceding it. With the introduction, Reaganomics intended to cut taxes, prioritize government deregulation, and shift funding from the domestic sphere into the military to check the Soviet Union by utilizing deterrence theory. A defining moment in Reagan's term of office was his speech in then West Berlin, where he demanded Soviet General Secretary Mikhail Gorbachev to tear down this wall, referring to the Berlin Wall, constructed to separate West and East Berlin. After he left office in 1989, Reagan became an iconic conservative Republican. Republican presidential candidates would frequently claim to share his views and aim to establish themselves and their policies as the more appropriate heir to his legacy. Vice President Bush scored a landslide in the 1988 general election. However, his term would see a divide from within the Republican Party. Bush's vision of economic liberalization and international cooperation with foreign nations saw the negotiation and signing of the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, and the conceptual beginnings of the World Trade Organization. Independent politician and businessman Ross Perot decried NAFTA and prophesied it would lead to outsourcing American jobs to Mexico, while Democrat Bill Clinton found agreement in Bush's policies. Bush lost re-election in 1992 with 37% of the popular vote, with Clinton garnering a plurality of 43% and Perot in third with 19%. While debatable if Perot's candidacy cost Bush re-election, Charlie Cook of the Cook Political Report attests Perot's messaging held more weight with Republican and conservative voters at large. Perot formed the Reform Party, and those who had been or would become prominent Republicans saw brief membership, such as former White House Communications Director Pat Buchanan and later President Donald Trump. In the Republican Revolution of 1994, the party led by House Minority Whip Newt Gingrich, who campaigned on the contract with America, won majorities in both chambers of Congress, gained 12 governorships, and regained control of 20 state legislatures. It was the first time the Republican Party had achieved a majority in the House since 1952. Gingrich was made Speaker of the House, and within the first 100 days of the Republican majority, every proposition featured in the contract with America was passed, with the exception of term limits for members of Congress. One key to Gingrich's success in 1994 was nationalizing the election. In turn, Gingrich became a national figure during the 1996 House elections, with many Democratic leaders proclaiming Gingrich was a zealous radical. The Republicans maintained their majority for the first time since 1928, despite the presidential ticket of Bob Dole Jack Kemp losing handily to President Clinton in the general election. However, Gingrich's national profile proved a detriment to the Republican Congress, which enjoyed majority approval among voters in spite of Gingrich's relative unpopularity. After Gingrich and the Republicans struck a deal with Clinton on the Balanced Budget Act of 1997, with added tax cuts included, the Republican House majority had difficulty convening on a new agenda ahead of the 1998 midterm elections. During the ongoing impeachment of Bill Clinton in 1998, Gingrich decided to make Clinton's misconduct the party message heading into the midterms, believing it would add to their majority. The strategy proved mistaken, and the Republicans lost 5 seats, though whether it was due to poor messaging or Clinton's popularity providing a coattail effect is debated. Gingrich was ousted from party power due to the performance, ultimately deciding to resign from Congress altogether. For a short time afterward, it appeared Louisiana Representative Bob Livingston would become his successor. Livingston, however, stepped down from consideration and resigned from Congress after damaging reports of affairs threatened the Republican House's legislative agenda if he were to serve as Speaker. Illinois Representative Dennis Hastert was promoted to Speaker in Livingston's place and served in that position until 2007. 21st century. A Republican ticket of George W. Bush and Dick Cheney won the 2000 and 2004 presidential elections. Bush campaigned as a compassionate conservative in 2000, wanting to better appeal to immigrants and minority voters. The goal was to prioritize drug rehabilitation programs and aid for prisoner reentry into society, a move intended to capitalize on President Bill Clinton's tougher crime initiatives such as the 1994 crime bill passed under his administration. The platform failed to gain much traction among members of the party during his presidency. With the inauguration of Bush as president, the Republican Party remained fairly cohesive for much of the 2000s, as both strong economic libertarians and social conservatives opposed the Democrats, whom they saw as the party of bloated secular and liberal government. This period saw the rise of pro government conservatives, a core part of the Bush's base, a considerable group of the Republicans who advocated for increased government spending and greater regulations covering both the economy and people's personal lives, as well as for an activist interventionist foreign policy. Survey groups such as the Pew Research Center found that social conservatives and free market advocates remain the other two main groups within the party's coalition of support, with all three being roughly equal. In the Pew Research Center found that social conservatives and free market advocates remain the other two main groups within the party's coalition of support, with all three being roughly equal in number. However, libertarians and libertarian-leaning conservatives increasingly found fault with what they saw as Republicans restricting of vital civil liberties while corporate welfare and the national debt hiked considerably under Bush's tenure. In contrast, some social conservatives expressed dissatisfaction with the party's support for economic policies that conflicted with their moral values. The Republican Party lost its Senate majority in 2001. When the Senate became split evenly, nevertheless, the Republicans maintained control of the Senate due to the tie-breaking vote of Republican Vice President Dick Cheney. Democrats gained control of the Senate on June 6, 2001, when Republican Senator Jim Jeffords of Vermont switched his party affiliation to Democrat. The Republicans regained the Senate majority in the 2002 elections. Republican majorities in the House and Senate were held until the Democrats regained control of both chambers in the midterm elections of 2006. In 2008, Republican Senator John McCain of Arizona and Governor Sarah Palin of Alaska were defeated by Democratic Senators Barack Obama and Joe Biden of Illinois and Delaware, respectively. The Republicans experienced electoral success in the wave election of 2010, which coincided with the ascendancy of the Tea Party movement, an anti-Obama protest movement of fiscal conservatives. Members of the movement called for lower taxes and for a reduction of the national debt of the United States and federal budget deficit through decreased government spending. It was also described as a popular constitutional movement, composed of a mixture of libertarian, right wing populist, and conservative activism. That success began with the upset win of Scott Brown in the Massachusetts special Senate election for a seat that had been held for decades by the Democratic Kennedy brothers. In the November elections, Republicans recaptured control of the House, increased their number of seats in the Senate, and gained a majority of governorships. The Tea Party would go on to strongly influence the Republican Party, in part due to the replacement of establishment Republicans with Tea Party style Republicans. When Obama and Biden won re-election in 2012, defeating a Mitt Romney-Paul Ryan ticket, the Republicans lost 7 seats in the House in the November congressional elections, but still retained control of that chamber. However, Republicans were not able to gain control of the Senate, continuing their minority status with a net loss of 2 seats. In the aftermath of the loss, some prominent Republicans spoke out against their own party. A 2012 election postmortem by the Republican Party concluded that the party needed to do more on the national level to attract votes from minorities and young voters. In March 2013, the National Committee Chairman Reince Priebus gave a stinging report on the party's electoral failures in 2012, calling on Republicans to reinvent themselves and officially endorse immigration reform. He said there is no one reason we lost. Our message was weak. Our ground game was insufficient. We weren't inclusive. We were behind in both data and digital, and our primary and debate process needed improvement. He proposed 219 reforms that included a $10 million marketing campaign to reach women, minorities, and gays, as well as settling a shorter, more controlled primary season and creating better data collection facilities. I'm going to leave this here and maybe continue and make a part 2.